So who knows who the first female judge in Indiana was? Anybody? Sue Shields. Does anybody know what year that was?
60-something.
64. So many of us know her, worked with her, appeared before her, and now who could say that about the first male judge in Indiana? We have indeed come a long way, baby. And this panel right here shows us that we have. So I'd like to start out and talk to you and say, instead of doing a regular biography, you can look at their biography on there, to say, what two events in your life got you sitting here? Judge Magnus-Stinson.
Oh, I had to go first. One, I would say, is in 1990, I had been litigating at Lewis Wagner for about 7 years, and I thought I would like to be a judge. So I approached the then Chief of Staff to then Governor Evan Bayh about the prospect, because I thought there might be a vacancy coming up in Marion County. I was quickly told that wouldn't happen, but the person said, hey, if you're interested, why don't you come join our staff? And that began a lifelong relationship that I've had with Governor Bayh. Worked hard for him for 4 years. So that was one event, was that meeting. And even though I was told no, I then later said yes. The second event that I'll talk about, because it sort of, I think, demonstrates the serendipity of when you can become a federal judge, is Barack Obama was elected in 2008. And Evan Bayh happened to also be a United States Senator at the time. So those two events are two, one I could control and one I didn't. Those would be two events I'd point to.
Great. How about you, Chief Judge Wood?
I think I would pick the first event as the accident that prompted me to go to law school at all, because I had no intention of going to law school. My older sister had done so for a while, and I took one look at her torts book one day, and I thought, ugh, what a bore that looks like. But fortunately, I gave it another chance. I decided 10 days before I was supposed to show up for graduate work in comparative literature that was just a little too ivory tower for my tastes, and I wanted something more engaged with the rest of the world. And a friend of mine that fall, I was living in Texas, said, you really should go to law school. And I couldn't think of anything else to do, so I thought, okay, I'll go to law school. But that dinner I had with this friend that prompted me to go to the University of Texas Law School was perfect. I knew after literally one day in law school that I had made the right decision, that everything I could ask for was there in a legal career. So that's the first thing. The second one, we're going to fast forward to when I was working at the Department of Justice. I was in the Antitrust Division, and I was the deputy, and among other things, I had responsibility for our international enforcement. And actually, we were going to Japan, and it was an event not unlike this one, in that the Attorney General was a woman, Janet Reno. The Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust was a woman, Ann Bingaman. The chair of the Federal Trade Commission was a woman, Janet Steiger, and obviously myself as deputy. And the Japanese had never dealt with this before. They had to change the entertainment program. I'm not kidding. I found this out from the staff later. But as I'm on this very lengthy overseas flight with Anne, where it takes quite a while to fly from Washington to Tokyo, it was relatively early in the Clinton administration, and I was just musing, and Anne said, where do you see yourself long term? And I said, boy, what I would really like is to be on the Federal Court of Appeals, but that's probably a pipe dream. And Anne looked at me, and she said, I'm going to make this my project. And when Anne, to this day, when Anne wants to get something done, Anne gets something done. Her husband, Jeff Bingaman, was in the Senate. The next thing I knew, I was meeting with senators. I was talking to people. I did happen to know who the White House counsel was. He was a good friend of mine, Abner Mikva. And again, as Jane says, a certain amount of serendipity, but there was a vacancy on the Seventh Circuit, and I was fortunate to be appointed.
CJ Rush.
Oh, there's a lot of events that lead you up, but probably a big one was I had moved 16 times before I graduated from high school. I was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania. My dad worked for the railroad, so I lived in every train town between Hoboken and the south side of Chicago. And what you learn when you're a little girl with a speech impediment, you learn resilience. So we just moved, and so you really kind of broke down that fear, or that fear that we have, and sometimes we have as women, of change and adapting. And then the second thing, and there was a lot in between, but 2012, Indiana was sort of at a place in history that we were one of, I think, 2 states in the country that didn't have a woman on the Indiana Supreme Court. And that, there comes a point that you say you can't look over your shoulder, look for somebody else to do it. So, I didn't think I didn't think I was a candidate. But there's about 18 of us that applied. And I remember my mother, who was living with me at the time, she came up, and I have a lot of kids. We always have a busy household. She goes, "You'll never get this." And I go, "Well, Mom, if I don't try, then I can't sit back and say, or maybe we can help push somebody else. Maybe this the candidacy can put." So finally, the 3 names that were given to the governor were 2 gentlemen and myself. So it's like, oh, now I really got to pay attention to this. But I think it was that time in history. I've always liked the court. I've always liked the law. I had been a litigator for 16 years. I'd been on the trial bench for 13. I had just been elected to my 3rd term, so it really wasn't on my trajectory. But at that time in history, it was like, enough. We need to change this.
I'm hearing relationships, serendipity, courage, hard work. Anything else that you can think of?
I think you have to have it within your sights. I think Chief Justice Rush just made a great point. You're not going to get it if you don't try. And trying, aside from maybe a bruised ego, which all of us should be able to overcome, trying isn't really that hard. You put your name in, you talk to people, you see whether there's any chance. And sometimes the answer may wind up being no, but you shouldn't let that discourage yourself.
Which I think leads me to, we all hear about successes and how successful you've been here, there, or everywhere, but we seldom learn about your failures. Would you share with us maybe one of your failures, Chief Justice Rush?
Well, ask my children. They could tick them off. When I got out of law school, I got married and I moved to Lafayette, Indiana, and this would have been in the early '80s. And you have to think about when in the early '80s, you couldn't think there was no woman that had been on the U.S. Supreme Court, so you didn't think about being a judge at that time. Great grades, great clerkships. I clerked in Houston and in Indianapolis, both for large law firms, and I couldn't get an interview. So I remember going like door to door. I'd sent out letters to the law firm in this. It was a medium-sized Indiana town, and there were a lot of questions. How many, about kids and income needs, given that I was married, and that was frustrating. And what you do is you sort of you maintain it with grace, but in your head you're talking to yourself saying, "This is not okay. Where I'm going to push through this and not let this defeat me." So I got an interview. And actually, had 2 interviews. One interview really asked a lot of questions about the number of children I was going to have, and I did not have 4 children, just to spite them. But I sort of had to put up with some, and then just sort of power through that at that time, and not let those questions or the fact that I couldn't grab on win. And then when in 1998, it was actually a large group of people, including the bar in my community, that asked me to run for judge because we were having problems on the juvenile bench. And so it was just, a series of, once you get into the community, it was a wonderful community to do that, but it took a lot to sort of break through within that in the early 80s. And a lot of women who graduated from law school in the late 70s, early 80s had similar
You talked
situations.
before about resilience. You want to talk a little bit about that and when you fail and how those that are resilient can bounce back?
Well, plus you have to, with regard to, I had a number of jury trials, and you don't always win all your jury trials, and you feel really bad for your clients when you see something that had happened on that. So you've got to bounce back from that. Or as a judge, you've got some cases where you see just horrific, absolutely horrific things that you've got to learn how to deal with that and then go on in society when you see sort of the worst of human nature in a lot of the cases. And even on the Indiana Supreme Court, I thought I was going to get away from molest cases somewhat, going off the juvenile bench, but there's probably not a day on the Indiana Supreme Court that we don't have horrific cases involving harms to children. So I think that resilience lets you kind of pick yourself up and seeing hope through the mire. When you see human frailties that come into our courtroom, I think that resilience helps to say, well, you got to push through, and just because this has happened doesn't mean that you can't make it better somehow in the position that you're in today.
Mm-hmm. I'm still upset that I didn't make National Junior Honor Society my junior year. I'm not kidding. And my mother
You have to let go of it, Nancy.
reminded me of that, you know. And ridiculous. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous. Jane?
So two things I'd say. One is it's maybe inappropriately personal, but to me, I always say, you know, I'm a decision maker for a living, but to me, the most important decision anybody can make is their choice of who they partner, with whom they partner. So I got a big F on my first choice there, and I share it only for this reason: I didn't listen to myself, and that I knew, and I didn't listen to myself. So when that voice is talking to you, I tell my daughters that when my daughter was thinking about doing something, she goes, "Mom, it just seems like too much." And I said, "I've ignored that voice for 25 years. You listen to yours. You acknowledge that." So that's one thing. The other thing, and you talked about grace and resilience. A couple times I've tried for judgeships and didn't get them. So I was a finalist for the Indiana Court of Appeals. That's not really a failure, but when you don't get it, the entire legal community knows. If I get reversed, the entire legal community knows. It's a very public way of getting an F. So as far as that goes, I always try to do what I think is the right thing under the law. You mentioned grace. I think grace is a great way to handle it, or just fooling yourself. I was very pregnant when I didn't get that job, but I got Grace Stinson instead. So I was like, okay, well, that person got the judgeship, but I got Grace. Now, that person wasn't ever going to get Grace, right? It's just, Grace was only going to be mine. But you just look at, I guess my point was, I looked for the good that came my way very shortly after that happened. And I see her here, and I've mentioned this before publicly, but I will again. Judge Moberly, who's the chief judge now of our bankruptcy court, has also been a finalist, and I've never seen somebody be so gracious in terms of handling that situation, and it's something I've always admired, and I think she's in a better place now. So
it turned out
I'm glad
all right.
she's there. Yeah,
For
turned
both
out
of
all
you.
right. Yeah.
How about you, Chief Judge Wood?
Oh, there certainly are times. I think what I'll share with you is when I first moved from Washington to the University of Chicago Law School. I moved there after my first year of teaching. I taught at Georgetown, but shortly after I started teaching at Georgetown, the University of Chicago got in touch with me and said, you know, hey, do you want to come teach here? Because I had already interviewed. And I said yes. And then I made a terrible mistake in just being unrealistic about what was even possible for me to do, because at the time I showed up to teach at the University of Chicago Law School, my older, of what ultimately became my 3 children, child was 19 months old, and the younger one was born in the middle of that month, so he was 2 weeks old. Oh. And on top of that, I had experienced quite unexpected but very serious life-threatening complications after his birth. So I had been in the hospital. So I got out of the hospital. 3 days later, I'm standing in front of a civil procedure class trying to teach this class. And I remember that quarter, which is the University of Chicago's system, as one giant blur. And I will be very frank with you, my teaching evaluations were not particularly good that quarter. And the fact that I was actually upright was probably the main thing, because I had started to go into shock from an antibiotic reaction. And I looked like an eggplant. I had turned purple from head to toe and itched over every square inch of my body. And what I should have done, but didn't do because I didn't have enough self-confidence, is I should have gone to the dean and said, look, I'm sick. I mean, yes, I know it's because I had a baby, but I have to have some time off. I didn't. I thought the only thing to do was just like punch on, punch on. So that's what I did, except that later that year, I tried to improve things, and I went to the Dean and I said, look, I know I'm supposed to write during the summer, but I need this summer to recover. Because the other scary thing that had happened was about halfway through the year, I realized that I was losing my hair. Every time I took a shower, I would just take like clumps of hair out of my head because of the medications to stop the allergic reaction. I thought I was dying. I had no idea what was happening. That, I was told, was going to cure itself. Apparently it did. But I said, you just have to give me the summer off, and I'm not going to write anything this summer. I'm just going to get better. He said, fine. That was fine. I was the only woman on the faculty, and I started that year. That was the fall of 1981, and it wasn't until 1997 that there was another woman on the University of Chicago law faculty with children. So this was unknown territory for them. And so then when I was pregnant with my third child, I called, it was the same dean. I called him and I said, I need to talk to you. So he came up to my office and I said, I'm going to take the spring quarter off and you're going to pay me. And he just sat there and I said, oh, come on, Gerhard, aren't you going to ask why? And he said, okay, why? And I said, because I'm going to have another baby and I'm not going through this again. He said, fine, done. I became just part of the informal network of women at the University of Chicago on the faculty, and eventually, a little while later, they adopted a policy.
So two things really strike me from what you're saying. I mean, really, attitude is really important. When you do go through a failure, attitude is so important. One of my things that really bothers me is the Debbie Downers. Always down, always upset, instead of, I'm going to make it through this, we're going to do this, rely on your relationships and friends. The other one that I hear is this feeling that I think a lot of us had, you busted out of it, of we have to be superwoman.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think we need to be women now in order to succeed? Or does the millennial generation have it right with balance? Anyone?
Well, I would like to say that it's unfair to ask anyone to be superwoman or put your brackets up and say any disadvantaged, or underrepresented group. You should be able to fail just as much as you can succeed, and you shouldn't have a different ratio imposed on you. I'm not sure that we're quite there yet in terms of people's perceptions.
Diane, your thoughts?
Well, I think that the extra one, we've all talked about how some things happened to us when we were pregnant or when we had our children. That is a reality that is out there. So one thing I would say is, and I've done this at seminars before, repeat after me, especially all the young women, repeat after me. No. Okay, so it is a useful word in the English language.
Yeah.
And so when you're, like the chief learned, when you are at capacity, and where's my friend Laura Briggs? There are times when people call us about things and we just say we are at capacity. We are at capacity, and that's okay. I mean, because something's going to slip.
Were you able to do that when you were younger, working your way up? Yeah.
Yeah.
So what advice would you have for younger women? I mean, would you still say no?
A couple things. You can, especially if we want to just talk about children, you can predict that. So within the organizations where you work, what are the policies? And then secondly, are they real policies? Are they good on paper? Or are they good in practice, right? Is this especially at law firms, is this what you say you're going to do, or is it what we really do, right? So you need to get yourselves into positions on committees and in leadership where if your firm has a policy for maternity leave, it's not only words on paper, it's words in practice. It's actions in practice. And get yourself involved in circumstances like that. Or you could be like my friend Kathleen Delaney, who decides she's going to set her own rules and start her own firm and practice terrific law, doing it her own way. Talk about courage. That takes a lot of courage. But there are, I think, ways that you can anticipate that and look for places where the world is more forgiving for those brief periods of time that you're off recovering from having a baby.
But I think there's a broader message here, too. One of my daughters is a lawyer, and it's really communication. It could be that the partners in your firm aren't themselves communicating well, and two different people come and assign a major assignment to you, and you look at the fact that there are 24 hours in a day and 7 days in a week, and you think, I really can't do justice to this. It could be uncomfortable. You may feel that you're going to be less valued or somehow looked down on if you complain about that, but don't think of it as complaining. They need to know what the work estimates are. And so I think the lesson goes to a broader point about communication.
Telepathy is not real, right? So it doesn't work at home. It doesn't work in the workplace. You have to communicate your thoughts or ask others for theirs to know what they're thinking.
DJ, anything you'd like to add?
I think you have to you've got to lead the charge on how you're going to get balance and what. And just like Diane just said, I had 3 children in 3 years and I was a partner in my law firm and it wasn't going to work. Something had to give. So instead of saying, what is your plan? I was the only female partner in my law firm. At that time, I came up with a plan. And just like you came up with your plan. And I think sometimes waiting around for somebody to give the plan to you isn't going to work. I think you develop, I think this can work, and I think this is how this can work, and this is how I can take, I can take this and I can do this. I'm not going to be able to do this for a period of time. And then once my, the third one was in school, I went back to full-time work. Now, did it cause some ripples in my professional? Yes, it did. But it was worth it. I mean, I will never look back on that time in life and think that because I gave up this, that, or that I left that meeting so I could go to the track meet. I mean, you sort of have to look at your priorities, but you also have to be organized. You can look at my purse and see a lot of lists on what you're doing. But you also have to have your feet firmly planted. But on times that you're not under that stress, you really have to perform. You really have to perform to sort of earn the fact that you're going to come and say, I want you to make this adjustment for me. So, I mean, I think right out of law school is a really good time to sort of be all in. Get your work ethic down. I think that work ethic, we know, and I hire young people, you see work ethic really quickly. When you're at work, and when you're at play, when you're relaxing, be it play and relaxing, and the more you can kind of put yourself full in at work, it'll allow you some balance on the other side.
So I think, some people say, okay, to get ahead, either I have to put my nose down and work, or I'm going to go and join a lot of organizations so they can see my leadership ability. What's your advice?
Mine would be pick what you want to do and then do it well, and don't spread yourself too thin. Don't be on 8 organizations so you're just listed as an organization. If you're going to be on an organization, do it because it's your passion. And the nice thing about the non-work organization or committee work you're doing, it really is a time to, it'll feed you. So I used to volunteer at a women's shelter and help women with regard to protective orders. And so I always did my pro bono work. I did things for fun, but I picked the pro bono work that I really thought would counterbalance maybe the practice that I had the other ways. And then it doesn't become work. But instead of joining 10 different organizations, because organizations are always looking for you, pick 1 or 2 and really give yourself fully to those instead of just being on it, but not really on it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, when I'm thinking about what I was doing, and one of the areas that I was very interested in because I had spent some time working on it at the State Department was international applications of antitrust law, which may not get all of you excited, but gets me excited. But there were some American Bar Association committees that focused on that. There were similar committees of the Chicago Bar Association. And what I thought was important was not, again, that you just sign up for a million committees, but that you be the kind of person that if they say, we need somebody, to organize this meeting, or we need somebody to help write this report, that you be reliable. Word will get around if you just sign up and don't do anything. They'll say, well, actually, this isn't a real member of the committee. But if you do it, and again, obviously figure out how you're going to have the time to do it, it repays itself with professional relationships first, actually very fine friendships ultimately. It's a way of just getting out of your little cocoon.
I remember when I was practicing law, I just had the nose in the books all the time, or I was in court trying cases. And then all of a sudden, I found this wonderful organization called NITA, where I could teach other people how to try cases. And the next thing I know, I had friends all over the country, and it made my job easier. Even though it took time to do that, it made my job easier.
And also fosters leadership among women. That's one of the questions we had a little beforehand phone call. And how does your name bubble to the top, for whatever it is you're interested in? And you can't be hiding off in a corner and expect other people to march around and find you. You have to be willing to put yourself out there somehow, raise your hand in some way. And this is certainly a good way to do it.
So sometimes life gets overwhelming. Kids, job, government shuts down. What do you do in those situations, Jane Magnus-Stinson?
Oh. Well, part of my deal for 2018, which is now carrying over into 19, is to just stay in my lane, right? So what's my lane? So my lane right now is having to plan for this shutdown. In the first conference call we had from Washington, the Office of General Counsel's representative said to us, and I quote, "Now, for any of you who thinks that the shutdown has anything to do with saving money or reason for that matter, just set that aside. This is not what it's about." And so anyway, it's just sort of getting your mindset in the attitude of controlling what you control and being a control person. This is, I want to go there and talk to them and get it mediated, call Sue Shields, send her over there, have her figured out. So it's just doing the best thing you can, try to consider the contingencies, and also being open to revision. So we're making this up, what we're doing with this plan. We're trying to do it in a way where we're taking care of our employees. We're trying to do it in a way where we can manage this unhealthy caseload that we have in our district. Anyway, so coping is to surround yourself with wonderful people. I had Laura Briggs surrounded for me. I didn't pick Laura, but I'd pick her 20 times out of 19. So you just have good people around you and control what you can control. So we have a plan. The chief told me she thought it was a well done plan, so I feel good about that. So we just sort of thought of and communicate, and I don't know, take a break, watch Mrs. Maisel, just get out of the moment.
I love that show.
It's a great show. Sing at church, it helps, those kinds of things to just get you off the silliness of something that you cannot control.
How about you, Loretta? What do you do to blow off steam?
Well, I think finding your lane is great. What you have control over, what don't you? And when you're the head of a branch of government, you've got some control. But then you've got to organize it so that it fits you. We had a great, Chief Justice Shepard was fantastic, but what worked for him didn't necessarily work for me. So I had to sort of take the judicial branch, and I like lanes and channels, and how you find out in that. So we had sort of a very lateral. He knew everything, so we had to do the reorganization, and that helped. And then really get people around you that you trust. It's hard for us not to try to do everything, but you can't. I used to have like 22 direct reports on a daily basis, people that would directly report. I had to move that around a lot, even though I'd like to have that many, because when you're the chief, you have the same caseload. You all have the same caseload, right? You have the same caseload, but you also have all the side administrative. So, it's trial and error, and you have missteps, but you get people that you trust around you. You delegate. I delegate to, I've got great justices. My colleagues are phenomenal at helping carry the load. And then
Is that an art, delegation? At first we all want to take everything on ourselves because we can do it better. What's the art of delegation? How do you convince your colleagues?
I think it's survival.
Yeah.
I think it's survival in that because again, if you're juggling too many balls, a lot of them are dropping, and these issues are too important to not let it drop. And then the question goes back to you had asked about how you maintain the balance. I mean, I keep my home in Lafayette. I mean, that's a balance question. I love my friends. I love my church. I'm Loretta there. But then I've got the balance of having the commute. So for me, having that life has really helped give me balance with coming down to Indianapolis and doing it. And we all believe in what we're doing, and that helps too. We all feel very passionate about the law and justice and the rule of law and what our job is, what our jobs are with regard to protecting it. And feeling that strongly convicted about what we're doing on a daily basis really helps us get it done. We're not just plodding through and serving our time.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Chief Judge Wood?
Well, I think I share what I think both of my colleagues here have already said, which is that the ability to delegate is one way you get through an otherwise unmanageable workload. And what I've learned over the years is that you're going to be effective in delegating if you yourself think through very carefully what it is you want done, and you set the outline, at least, of that task for the other person. And then you learn to back off. You realize that that person might not get from point A to point D quite the same way you would have. And you have to ask, but does it matter? Maybe they found a better way to do it. Maybe they just found a way that they thought was going to work better for the people involved. So just because it's not an absolute carbon copy of what you think you would have come up with doesn't mean that it was a bad work product. And the other thing is, if it wasn't, maybe you didn't delegate very well in the first place. Maybe you weren't clear about what you had to do. So I have certainly worked on that for a long time, since I was at the Antitrust Division, where I certainly had to delegate to people, given that I was also, in addition to international, doing all of the appellate work and the legal policy work in the division. So that's one thing. And the other thing, saying my husband has, but I think it's actually right. He just says 1 foot in front of the other. I mean, you can't look at this mountain in front of you and be overwhelmed by the size. No one is going to climb the mountain in one day. You're going to do what you can do in a day, and you have to be willing to come home at night and say, I triaged the best I could. I took care of the things that were most important, and if there's something that I missed, I'm undoubtedly going to have an email about it at 9 o'clock in the evening anyway, but probably, it was fine.
So society has this way of undermining women. We had the Northwestern study that came out that said that female justices of the United States Supreme Court are interrupted 3 times more than men. We all probably have been in a room where male colleagues has said, well, what she's trying to say is, or we're in a room with a number of people and you have a great idea as a woman, and the next thing you know, 10 minutes later, it's not your idea anymore, it's attributed to a male. I'm wondering if that happens to you in your positions anymore. If it doesn't, I'm sure at some time it did. And what advice would you give to women when they're in that position? Well, this is good silence.
Well,
We don't want to interrupt each other.
yeah. I'm in a different role being in a trial court because I don't have colleagues, and the banter isn't as formal. It's usually more, you take your turn, I'll take my turn. But I'll just give you this example, and it's one of those things where it's a mini failure of not thinking of the cleverest comeback at the time. But this was a case I'll just call petulance v. arrogance, because that was the mindset of the lawyers. And during a pretrial conference, one lawyer said that he might be objecting to an exhibit on his opponent's list, and he said, I think I might be objecting to their expert CV. And then he paused and he looked at me, he goes, curriculum vitae, like a resume? And I told this story once at a dinner with women, and somebody said, I said, I know what a curriculum vitae is, and somebody said, you should have said, and I even have one, right? But anyway, but it was just, and I looked up this guy. I'm like, your law school's no better than mine. Do you understand? I'm a presidentially appointed person. Anyway, so it was just such sort of a, little missy pat on the head from somebody who's A, younger than I was, and B, no more accomplished in any way. And I just thought, and this was last year, so this wasn't a long time ago, right? And it's not if it were somebody who practiced here, I might post-case have a conversation about it. It's not somebody that doesn't practice law in the Southern District of Indiana, so I won't waste my breath or time. But so does it still happen? You bet it still happens. And he won, but it was through no help from me. Let's just put it that way.
Any other thoughts about what women can do in that situation? You know, we have this, we can't be too aggressive, and we can't be too weak, and there's this middle ground there, and just because of society, what do you
When
think?
I'm in an oral argument, I'm not thinking about I'm the only woman up there.
Mm-hmm.
There's just not time to think about that because you're trying to figure out where they're at. But if they pop off my question by ignoring it, and then somebody else interrupting, I go, well, back to my question. You just bring them on back, back to what I'm saying. No, that's not what I was trying to say. Or sometimes I'll have a litigant, somebody argue a case, trying to tell me what a case I'd written said, and it's like, I wrote that. Rucker was great. He'd go, she wrote that case. She knows what you're saying on the argument. So, I think I circle back around and just don't take it. I'll circle back around and say, no, let's go back to that question, because it's really easy. You only have 20 minutes, and I was talking to Diane, you have 10 minutes sometimes, and, we all we know these cases by the time they come before us. And sometimes you ask a question, and a lot of times you ask a question, they don't answer that question anyway. So, and they do that regardless. But I don't have a scorecard in looking at that. I remember one of the first cases I had in the Indiana Supreme Court. Any Maurer graduate? Anyone have Tom Schornhurst for criminal law? Anybody? Okay, so he was really good to women back in the day, wasn't he? So he was like always on me if it was like a case with a horrible sexual pattern. I remember I went up to his office as a law student and said, what's with you? And these questions. And he goes, well, I'm really trying gals did not play sports in high school, and law is competitive, and I'm just trying to toughen you up. And I always like, well, I did play sports in high school. I wrote for the paper because I was mad because we didn't get letter jackets, and we finally got windbreakers by the time I was done. So anyway, I'm on the Indiana Supreme Court, and who's arguing in front of me? Tom Schornhurst. So you know what goes around comes around.
Yes.
Yes.
There's a very famous true story about that, well known among federal judges of a certain age. There was a wonderful judge named Phyllis Kravitch who was on the 11th Circuit, and she lived in Savannah, but the 11th Circuit normally sits in Atlanta, as you probably know. And Phyllis, who's since passed away, was a very petite, I'm sure she wasn't much more than 5 feet tall, but perfectly dressed all the time, just a lovely woman of that part of the country. And one day she was standing out in front of the hotel where they stayed in Atlanta for oral arguments, and it was raining and it was nasty, and there was a line for taxi cabs, and she was patiently waiting. She got to the front of the line for her taxi cab and was just about to get into a cab that pulled up when a man elbowed by her and said, "Excuse me, but I've got a very important appointment." So she backed off, let him take the cab. She got another cab. This is it. Yes, wait for it. They called the first case, and he was the lawyer appearing before her. So you shouldn't assume. But I think there's a difference between being aggressive and being firm. And I am a big believer in whether it's going back to your question. I've been interrupted by lawyers where my male colleagues on the bench don't think they would have been interrupted. And I try to just focus on the case and not let it annoy me. But you can be firm. You can be firm in a meeting. If it was your point and somebody else took it up, you can see, I'm glad John thought that my point was a good idea. There are ways of doing it without being completely obnoxious, and I think that they're worth doing.
I've also heard that when you have 2 women in a room or 3 women in a room, then the other woman can help and say, yeah, Diane had a great idea, and that we should be doing that. I also think that we sometimes are our worst enemies because we undermine ourselves. How many guys say I'm sorry as often as we say I'm sorry? I'm sorry, and it's really not an apology. It's just a phrase that we say. Or I think it's only my opinion, but and sometimes we're undermining ourselves. I do have another question. Did you ever feel backlash from other women? And if so, how do you respond to that?
Can't think of many. I mean, I know people think that happens, but I've worked with a lot of women over. I mean, as I was telling you, at the antitrust division, it was unusual, but I mean, it was great. I enjoyed it. And on the court, I'm the second woman ever to be appointed to the Seventh Circuit. So not the first, like your Chief Justice, but Alana Rovner was appointed in 1992, and she was the first one, and she's still an active judge in the court. So talk about current events. We're in the world of current events. We now have a good number of women in the court: Diane Sykes, Amy Barrett, Amy St. Eve. So for an 11-person court, the numbers are starting to look pretty good. But I have not, in any gendered way, really experienced women not being helpful.
Same for you, Jane?
I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a woman that I worked with at the first job I had. She was my age. We actually were college sorority sisters. And we were getting a sense that we were being played off each other.
Mm-hmm.
And we just made a pact one day coming back from lunch. And I said, we cannot let them do this.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot let them do this. And we didn't. And that was good. And I'm thinking, now that I'm thinking about this, I had a similar conversation with Judge Barker when I started the court, with the court, that we just determined we wouldn't agree on everything. We were, very different people, but that we would not be a spectacle, right? We were just going to be colleagues. And there was an intentionality about that at the beginning that's grown into very, very deep personal affection. But I think that's a mindset, right? So it's something, again, I'm talking about my children, but I try to teach my daughters, if something good happens for your friend, the appropriate emotional response is joy. It's not jealousy, it is joy. You need to be happy for your friend. It's much more pleasant to be joyful anyway, right? But so I think if you spin that and celebrate the successes of your friends, men, women, whomever, it's just, you have a more pleasant life.
I heard a saying once, girls compete, women empower.
Yeah, it's good.
And I like that.
My experience was the other way, really. When I was appointed to the Supreme Court, and then when I became Chief Justice, it was more the other way. When I was appointed to the Supreme Court, they announced to all the trial court judges in the state that I had been selected. And they were screaming and crying, the women judges, because we were so tired of it for so long. And then when I became Chief Justice, Jane said they were all screaming over in the federal. I mean, and it's not me personally. It was the fact we need to see women in these positions. And one of the greatest things happened I got a picture of a little fourth grader, and she had a dark wig on, some thick black glasses, and a black robe, and she got to dress up as the Chief Justice of Indiana this year for history. So I've got her picture in my chambers. Her name's Maddie. So to make these opportunities and to support each other, I went up to Amy when Amy Barrett made it to the Seventh Circuit. I went up to her investiture. It was in Notre Dame. It was lovely. She was the first woman from Indiana that had gotten appointed to the Seventh Circuit. So we have to take part in that. And Sarah Evans Barker and I are working to get not a memorial because she's alive. We want to get something for Sue Shields. I mean, this is a big deal. And you're all young. You don't remember Sue Shields. We remember Sue Shields. We remember Sarah. Sarah has the courtroom. So we have to look at these people that did all this work for us before and not forget. So if you know anyone in Hamilton County, I'd love to have had the courthouse named after her, but I'd like a plaque outside, But then we have to push and we have to kind of band together to get this done.
So one last question before we take your questions. There was a newly elected congresswoman from New Mexico, and she said, I want my constituents to know and realize that the door is open, that the ceiling is broken, so I intend to leave the ladder open. What do you do to leave the ladder open? And I know all of you do. Chief Justice, I know you can do it right away, right off the top of your head.
Yeah, and I think we have an obligation. I feel an obligation to do that. I mean, I talk to women's groups. If the Allen County Women's Bar Association wants me to speak, or that, I try to make myself available, even though it's good to say no to things, because I think we have to be there. It's like you have to see it to think you can be it. And quite often, and I wish it wasn't like this, you've got to tap somebody on the shoulder and tell them, I see this in you. We had people that did this to us, and we need to really, by leaving that ladder down, as she said, we have to do it. I invited 60 lawyers to my house a year ago for dinner and said, okay, gals, it's time. You can't sit back and think we don't like the way things are, and you need to run for school boards, you need to run for political office, you need to think about applying for judges. I mean, you're sort of the leadership that's going to come out of this next generation might just not happen without some of us that have come before, tapping them on the shoulder saying, I see something in you that maybe you don't see in yourself. None of us up here sat there when we were 20 years old ever thinking we were going to be here. Probably at 30 years old or 40 years. I mean, we didn't think we were going to be here. But we did have people along the way say they saw something in us that we didn't see in ourselves. So by keeping the ladder down, sometimes you got to walk them over to the ladder and say, head on up, it's your turn.
And I know you also appoint young women
I
to
love
commissions.
to appoint young women to
Yeah.
commissions.
And it's,
And I've got to give, Governor Holcomb, he's had, let me make sure I get the math right, ladies, 33 appointments, 13 of them have been women? 13,
Yep.
okay.
That's good.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with all of that, but I'll say in my own hiring for law clerks, I typically take 3 law clerks a year. I get applications from all over the country from the most amazing women, and I probably over this many years on the court, maybe 60% of my clerks have been women. So, I mean, it's not that I have anything against men. Don't worry, I don't at all. And I've had some fabulous male clerks as well. And which leads me to my next point. I think it's just critically important to find ways to foster the careers of the young people who are coming behind you, whether they're male or female or minority or whatever they are, and spot these opportunities. I've nominated several of my former clerks for membership in the American Law Institute, which is a very prestigious organization, and they are now members, and so I'm glad to see them moving along into that type of leadership. I'll see a commission or a committee or something, and I'll say, the person you really want working on this is so-and-so, and I try to, bring forward these names. So sometimes they're little ways and sometimes they're bigger ways, but if you're always thinking of yourself as just a piece of the puzzle, we, as Chief Justice Rush was saying, we're standing on some other people's shoulders. We need to help the next group along.
Same.
same. Okay, now's the time. We have about 5 minutes for your questions. If you have any questions, this has been really fun, I have to tell you. This is great.
And you can ask Nancy questions too.
I've participated. Anyone? Yes. Can you stand up? So it's easier to hear if you stand up.
But I've read some of your cases, and I know sometimes when oh man, she's getting mad about this. I'm thinking about one recently talked about democracy and older woman and into it. But so how do you long time that affects you. And obviously you have to rule on the law. That emotion of what's right.
Right, it's great.
Well,
Great question.
I try sometimes not to be Sometimes cases just call for a little dose of outrage. Okay. And most of the time I just try to be calm, but my whole point when I write is to talk about the case, talk about the motion I'm dealing with right then and there, and explain why I'm doing what I'm doing according to the law, which I always try to do, follow the circuit precedent religiously. And sometimes I say to myself, or sometimes if we've been frustrated by a case, I'll have to do some toning down edits. But so when I was a major felony criminal court judge, my colleague Judge Pratt and I shared this, where you see the firsthand worst crimes, murders, where people are suffering terrible losses, or child molest or things like that. When I had that job, I had tiny children, and so I would just come home and it was instantly, we all talked about this, mom, so you just go into mom mode and you don't think about it. I have more written work in this job, so I try to be careful, but sometimes there's all the care in the world can't disguise what issues you're presented with, and so you need to remark about it. It's a confounding sense more than when you're confounded. It's you have to write it that way.
I guess which leads me to, when did you find your voices? I mean, I think all of you have individual voices.
A hard question for me to answer because certainly over the years, each year I, in one fashion or another, probably write about 100 opinions and orders, which is a fair amount of writing. And obviously, we sit in panels of 3 the vast majority of the time. So part of the voice that I've adopted, I try to be very on the merits about things. I am much more likely to obtain agreement by my other 2 colleagues, whoever they may be, if I have something that's airtight, on the law. And that's what we're supposed to be doing anyway,
Right.
And so I don't like cutesy things and opinions. I don't think that's the time. I actually think it's disrespectful of the litigants. There was a judge who used to sit in the Ninth Circuit who wrote a famous opinion in which he embedded the names of something like 35 movies and it's like, oh, come on. This is somebody's real case. You shouldn't do that. So my tone is maybe not the most flamboyant, but that's on purpose.
She did not like my Bruno Mars quote in one of my cases, I'm sure.
What was it? I have to.
Oh, it had to do with one of the cases with the NCAA about whether college athletics was employment, and we quoted the Lazy song that you can't just mess around and get a college degree.
I love it. I love it. Any other questions?
I love Bruno Mars.
Questions? Well, then I get to ask more then if you don't. How about, did you all have a mentor? And if so, was it male or female? Does it make a difference? And how do you get a mentor?
Chief Justice.
I didn't have, I didn't have one. I mean, I had various people that kind of picked me up throughout my life, and still are, but there's just not one that I can go to it. And sometimes it's, somebody that you just have a short interaction with that can have such a big impact on you, on getting something done. Sarah Evans Barker. I mean, Sarah was somebody who I watched from afar. I actually tried a case. She doesn't remember it. Virginia McCarthy Dill was somebody, you looked at some of the women back in the day that just seemed to get it done. I liked how they ran their courtroom. I liked their fun sense of humor when you got to know them and their balance. But there have been people, all along the way. Justice Rucker being able to hang out in his chambers. There's so many of them, so there's not. I've been very fortunate with regard to previous partners, colleagues on the court. Chief Judge Vaidik, we don't, when we get together, we can't talk fast enough. Jane and I like to have sleepovers. I really like her and her husband, and like to take their dog for work. So there's a lot of people that, sort of reach out to you. All the women on the federal bench here, when I became, you feel, and I was just talking to Doris about this, you can feel very isolated as a judge. When I came down, I left everything I knew to come down to Indianapolis to work for the court. They took me all out to lunch, and it was a small gesture. And so then I sent a bus over and brought them all over to the court to give them for lunch. So everybody that touches you gives a piece of themselves to you, and I've been very fortunate to have a lot of people give quite a bit to me.
So I think we're going to end it here on that note. Thank you all for giving a piece of yourself to this audience. I think that we've learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you.